If God made his promises clear, that God has really made promises to the Jewish people, and he is going to keep his word, that should give us encouragement. Those of us who are in the body of the Messiah, think about it. Students ask me all the time. They say, what difference does this make? And I always say, if God is unfaithful to Israel, he can be unfaithful to the church. Of course, one of the things that people are bringing up now in the news and they're asking questions about is a system called dispensationalism. And the people tend to be very dismissive of it. I want to explain what dispensationalism is, because when I ask people all the time, well, what do you think dispensationalism is? They say all sorts of outrageously wrong things. So I'm going to give the Rydelnik simple definition of dispensationalism. Dispensationalism is a system of interpretation. It is a hermeneutic. It is a method of interpreting the Bible which takes the plain sense of the text, not, I wouldn't say the literal sense, but the plain meaning of the text consistently. Now, every evangelical wants to interpret the Bible according to its plain meaning. But what dispensationalism does is it interprets the text according to its plain meaning, even in prophetic passages. So that in Ezekiel chapter 37, when it talks about the dry bones being the land of Israel, this is Israel being restored to her land, it's not taken figuratively, it's taken according to its plain sense, even in prophecy. And so that's all it is. It's a system of interpretation that takes the plain sense in a consistent way, even in prophetic passages. The second aspect of the dispensational hermeneutic is that dispensationalism interprets the Bible progressively, not retrospectively. And what I mean by that is that most interpreters take the New Testament and read New Testament truth back into the Old Testament. Rather, dispensationalism follows progressive revelation as God reveals more and more and more, and reads the New Testament through the Old. People who are not dispensational read the Old Testament through the New. Rather than do that, I think that as we go progressively through the Bible, we get to the New Testament writers and readers, we're reading the Old Testament for what it said, and the New Testament is understood by the context of the whole Old Testament. So that's what dispensationalism does. It takes a plain interpretation of the text consistently, even in prophecy, and it also reads the Bible progressively, not retrospectively. It reads the New Testament through the Old, not the Old through the New. That's the system of interpretation. It leads to a clear distinction between the church and Israel. Now, if there's ever any overlap that dispensationalism sees between the church and Israel, it would be two circles that overlap. You have Israel on one side, and you have the church on the other, and the place that overlaps is the remnant, the Jewish believers. The Jewish believers are part of Israel as the remnant of Israel, and also as the Jewish wing of the church. That's the only overlap. But otherwise, it sees a God's plan for the church, God's plan for Israel. It clearly rejects the idea of replacement theology or supersessionism, or even an expansion of Israel to somehow no longer mean the ethnic descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but now it's Jewish and Gentile believers. It understands that there's a God's plan for the church and God's plan for Israel, that God has a nationally chosen people and a spiritually chosen people. And that's what dispensationalism understands. Some have said, oh, dispensationalism is just so new. How can you even believe it? And it's true. If you go back to early church history, although they did believe in a 1,000-year reign of Jesus the Messiah on earth, they weren't just those who believed in no 1,000-year reign. That's called amillennialism. But no, they did believe in that. But very early on, as early as Justin Martyr, he began to adopt replacement theology. He said that the church has somehow replaced Israel because of Israel's disobedience. Nevertheless, if you look at the history of how to take the Bible in its plain sense, as dispensationalism does, there have always been those who have held that. William Watson wrote a book called Dispensationalism before Darby, Darby being the 19th century Plymouth Brethren who sort of systematized dispensationalism first. But he does this whole historical book going back ages and ages to show that there were those who held the very same principles of Darby way before Darby. But even so, Darby in the mid-19th century was the one that first articulated and systematized dispensational teaching. And people say, well, that's so new. If it's the 19th century, it's not something, it's new. Well, I don't think it's new. I think it's recovered. I think that's how the New Testament writers read the Old Testament. It's recovered the teaching. And you say, well, don't you think it took a long time? Well, if you look at the church fathers from the 2nd century onward, most of them did not believe in justification by faith. From the 2nd century up until the 16th century, Luther comes along and makes the case for justification by faith. And, well, if that's the case, don't you think that's a fairly new doctrine? Really, when you think about it, it took a millennium and a half to recover justification by faith. People would say, well, it's not really a new doctrine. It just recovered the Pauline doctrine of justification by faith. And I agree. But if it took a millennium and a half to recover that one, which is even more important, why should we be surprised that it took 18 centuries or 17 centuries to recover the teaching about God's faithfulness to Israel and what is taught in dispensationalism about how to interpret the Bible? That's not something that should surprise us. Sometimes it takes a long time to recover biblical teaching. That's what dispensational does. In America, many people were dispensational without ever knowing the term, because there was a study Bible that came out at the turn of the century called the Scofield Study Bible, and it was very popular in the 40s. If you were an American evangelical, you had your Scofield Bible, and Scofield was a firm adherent of a dispensational hermeneutic. He has fallen into disfavor, and people don't like it, but the principles that you found there, they've been modified and they've been adapted, but they are still true. And so we still see the Bible this way. And if God made his promises clear, that God has really made promises to the Jewish people, and he is going to keep his word, that should give us encouragement. Those of us who are in the body of the Messiah, think about it. Students ask me all the time. They say, what difference does this make? And I always say, if God is unfaithful to Israel, he can be unfaithful to the church. Now, here's what I mean by that. Romans 8 ends with that very strong phrase by Paul that nothing will separate us from the love of God, which is in the Messiah, Jesus, right? Nothing. It's not possible. And in the book of Romans, there's always this unseen objector. He's there making his case. And Paul has him in his head. And so what Paul does is he constantly addresses what the unseen objector is going to raise. That's just good communication. So at the end of Romans 8, he says, nothing will separate us from the love of God. And then he launches in Romans 9 through 11, in answer to the unseen objector. He launches into his section on Israel. What's the unseen objector thinking? He's saying, oh, wait, God used to love Israel. Israel failed him. He got rid of him. What do you mean nothing will separate us from the love of God, which is in the Messiah, Jesus? If we fail him the way Israel did, he'll get rid of us. And Paul then shows God's faithfulness to Israel, that God's going to keep his word. Basically, our own spiritual security as members of the body of the Messiah, as members of the church, we have that security because Paul uses Romans 9 through 11 to vindicate the faithfulness of God to his people, that he will fulfill every promise that he made to Israel. That is what's so crucial. Our own spiritual security rests on the fact that we have a faithful God who keeps his promises to Israel, so we are assured that he will keep his promises to the church as well. I think that we can't just throw that away. You know, there are people, commentators, booklets. When I was in college, I was going to teach the book of Romans, so I went to get a study guide for Romans, and I picked one up in the Moody bookstore, and it left out Romans 9 through 11 in the book of Romans. It said Romans 9 through 11 is not included because it's a digression. It doesn't fit the argument of the book. Well, that's ridiculous. Of course it fits the argument. It vindicates God's faithfulness. God is faithful to Israel, and so we can be assured that he'll be faithful to the church. That's why this hermeneutic is so important, because without it, we have no confidence that God will keep his promises to the church.